Okay, now we're going to get into organic fertilizers and amendments. There's a lot to consider here, a lot to say about it. This will provide a bit of an overview, maybe a framing of how we can think about managing and quantifying some of the nutrient content in organic fertilizers and amendments. Okay, but let's start by reminding everyone that there are organic and inorganic fertilizer sources, okay, in general sense. And again, organic meaning that this is nutrient that is associated with some sort of carbon backbone. Inorganic would be the converse of that. So organic fertilizer sources come in a variety in shapes and sizes. Some are more plant available, some are less plant available. Typically, compared to a mineral or inorganic fertilizer source, organic sources of fertilizer are going to be less available. And it often, as we've discussed already, that requires some sort of nutrient transformation, right? So a mineralization event typically mediated by soil microbes. Organic fertilizer sources, the content can be highly variable depending on where it came from, what was added or what that animal ate, for example. And then once we apply it, even if we know exactly what it is, once we apply it, the nutrient behavior in soil can be more complex and difficult to predict. We juxtapose that with inorganic or mineral fertilizer. This is a fertilizer where the form is typically by design in a very available form. It requires often little to no nutrient transformation, so it's a variable soluble form of plant nutrient. The content, because it is from a manufactured process or some sort of derived process, we typically know exactly what we're dealing with. It's often labeled. These are, almost always purchased inputs. And all this leads to nutrient behavior once we apply it in the soil, relatively predictable in terms of what is plant available. Okay. And then we can think about that first category of organic fertilizer types, and of course this is what we're talking about here. But what is available, and what are we actually talking about? Well, there's many ways we can slice and dice these. We think about commercially available versus grow your own. But organic fertilizers, organic amendments can come in many, many different shapes and sizes. Examples would be manure, compost, biosolids, pelleted or processed types of manures. So, pelleted poultry manure would be a good example of that. There's specialty products, all kinds of stuff that's on the market: fish meal, blood meal, bone meal, etc., etc. And then there's also, this whole kind of movement or just orientation or philosophy in terms of growing your own fertilizer. And this is, thinking about increasing the internal cycling of the pre-existing nutrients in your field. Crop residues are a good example of, fertilizer that can be recycled and be reused. Cover crops, fresh manure, and compost. These are all nutrients that, thinking about kind of closing that cycle, that are closing the nutrient balance on your farm, growing your own or producing your own, feeds into that. So determining nutrient crop needs. So for organic nutrients, there's a lot of information. Most of university recommendations are based on essentially inorganic nutrients. So there's networks, extension networks, or crop consultants, retailers, etc., that will tell you how many pounds of P2O5 you need to apply, or how many pounds of MAP or DAP, to meet the crop needs. For organic nutrients, there's much less information, there's much greater uncertainty, and there's just a much larger variety of different types and systems out there. So it becomes pretty challenging to come up with like a coherent set of recommendations or an exact prescription, for example, right? So we can provide, if you're using anhydrous ammonia, we can often provide a pretty precise prescription of how much to apply. But when you say you're using compost, um, and we don't, for example, might not know, or a manure or whatever it might be, if we don't know the nutrient content, it becomes challenging. Even if we do know the nutrient content, there can be issues with that. So this is a major challenge in terms of managing crop nutrients from organic sources. So this is something that we spend a lot of time talking about, or thinking about. Uh, Hopefully you've got a good understanding of why managing organic nutrients is more difficult. But just to be clear, let's kind of get into this a teeny bit more. So we've already discussed there's many factors that contribute to nutrient availability. It's not just how much fertilizer is added. It's not just the soil, the pre-existing soil, but there's climate factors, there's crop factors, there's soil factors. There's a lot of things that we can think about. And really the rub is that when we're talking about organic sources, transformation before uptake is necessary, and that requires mineralization. And that is uh, driven by the microbial food web, the microbes in the soil. And microbes are, of course, living, respiring things, critters, and they are affected by temperature, pH, water aeration, water and aeration of that soil. A lot of things that we really don't have finite control of, or kind of vary greatly in time and space. So there's just this inherent uncertainty that we bring in anytime we're talking about processes that are microbially mediated. But not to scare folks off, because there's lots and lots of benefits of using organic fertilizer sources, and part of this is um, a personal choice that a grower might use. Part of this is what is most economical. Part of this is like equipment constraints and needs. But there's lots of benefits of using organic fertilizer sources. So uh, provides a range of not just macronutrients but micronutrients, and often in stable forms that kind of stick around. And so, a lot of times when farmers will be asking me about micronutrients, one of the, we've talked about why that's challenging to make recs for micronutrients, but one of the first, easiest things you can recommend if people are interested in or believe that their fields need micronutrients, it's apply an organic amendment. If you've got access to manure or compost, apply that to the field, and in many ways you're going to increase the availability and the solubility of micronutrients. So that's just an easy fix. Maybe not particularly an economical fix, but an easy fix if you've got access to those sources. So of course, when we use organic amendments or fertilizers, we reduce the expense, and we turn a waste into a resource. So there's just great logic and ecology involved in using waste products or organic amendments that are pre-existing on your farm. Closing the nutrient cycle, of the nutrients that are used and recycled in your farm. Of course, that's part and parcel with that second bullet. And then just this idea that when we're adding an organic fertilizer source, by default we're adding organic matter. And organic fertilizers improve organic matter and increase organic matter typically, which has a whole suite of as we understand, has a whole suite of benefits. So improving soil structure and tilth, improving the ability of that soil to hold and retain water, um, in, whether that be through just increased pore space, or available water content, water holding capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So we're adding soil organic matter increases or improves a source of slow release nutrients, and it's always going to be feeding that soil food web and typically increasing microbial biomass. So these are really important concepts in terms of, anytime we're able to add organic matter, we're typically going to be increasing the health of that soil, the ability of that soil to function more efficiently, and improve, in many ways, the ability of that soil to maintain productivity and to produce productive plants. So manure, kind of like the original fertilizer source, right? Manure is a valuable fertilizer and has been used for many, 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 centuries, millennia, really, for growing crops. And this is something, we can think about in an agricultural context, but just thinking about from any sort of evolved natural grassland, tall grass prairies or the shortgrass prairies in the United States as an example where large ruminant livestock, with the grazing and the recycling of nutrients, it's all part of that ecosystem. We can take that, adopt some of those principles, and move that into a managed system, and which has been done. But manure has been around for longer than all of us, and will be here. So, understanding nutrient contents of manure is critical for managing a profitable business. We typically almost always recommend sampling and analyzing nutrient content. Worst case scenarios, we use published book values, but we have to understand that manure content varies. There's a lot, there's references out here. These are tables from the Haviland textbook that I've scanned, but the top table just shows that repeated applications improve soil properties. We've got application rate in tons per acre per year, and then what that's done to organic matter content, subsequent increase in CEC, the increase in pH, and then increases in extractable nutrients, and then this pore size, which has great implications in terms of of the ability of that soil to store water, and then in turn, when in drought periods in the summer, be able to provide water to that plant. So we've talked about this plenty of times already, but there's a large degree of variability in nutrient concentration depending on the manure, where it came from, what the animal is, how it's handled, does it have bedding, So here's just some examples of the variability. Just look at total nitrogen or available nitrogen between poultry and swine or beef cattle, just huge differences, and same with P2O5. Okay, so suffice it to say that depending on the livestock in a grower's operation, the nutrient content of that manure can vary quite widely. Handling and storage has large implications for nutrient content, particularly nitrogen, because of the ability or that nitrogen that might get lost via denitrification or volatilization. And so this is just, again, a table showing the percent N loss depending on how manure is stored, hauled, handled, etc., and then how it might be. So this is a solid systems with manure pack or an open lot or a deep pit versus liquid systems, an anaerobic pit, an oxygenated ditch, or a lagoon. You can get very, very wide ranges of nitrogen loss based on that. And same thing with volatilization losses down here. Okay. In terms of, so this is on the application side. So you take that manure and you apply it. Are we going to be broadcasting it and incorporating or not? Or are we going to be injecting it? So, we've discussed this already before, but broadcast and leaving it on the surface and losses can be quite large. Anytime we incorporate the broadcast with cultivation or subsurface nice, so both of these would be subsurface incorporation, right, or subsurface placement, or just some sort of soil incorporation. We see our nitrogen losses can be much less with that scenario. So to recap, like the variability of manure sources can vary by what the animal is eating, of course, the type of animal it is, if it's a solid or liquid, the storage method, lagoon stratification, how long it's been stored, and if it's been mixed with bedding. So many factors that all go into this. And again, we this is like exactly why we recommend analysis be part of the program when when you're assessing this as a grower. And typically growers are very specialized with their raising livestock, and they're just working with, say, um, you know dairy cattle, or they're just working with poultry, for example, raising poultry. And so they typically have a much better idea of like what the nutrient content is. Even if they don't regularly test, they've got, you know they understand their system. um, well, we'd hope anyways that they understand that what they're working with and what their typical nutrient concentrations might be in the livestock that they're handling and applying. Okay, so an important concept when we're talking about manure and any organic fertilizer source for that matter is plant available nitrogen. And so this is a term used to not assess the total nitrogen or nutrient in a plant or in a product, but how much is going to be available to that plant. And so, PAN is often um, used. And so there's different ways that we calculate this, but for example, for manure, we might think of, uh, if you do a manure analysis, submit that to a commercial testing lab, they might measure total organic nitrogen, they might measure ammonium nitrate, and there's these calculations that occur, and they're basic rules of thumb, but they give you a much better idea of what we're dealing with. And so kind of a common calculation for manure would be you take that organic nitrogen, you multiply by 25%, and then you take that ammonium and you multiply it by 50%. So essentially, a quarter of the organic N and 50% of the ammonium will be plant available. And that's usually defined as essentially like over the course of the next growing season. So. And then another challenge, we've talked about this a little bit with phosphorus, but just it's worth revisiting that N and P ratios in manure often do not match exactly what a crop's fertility requirements are. Okay, so, and that's because just what we talked about before with like nitrogen losses. Anytime we're taking and we're storing, say, manure, or we're making compost, we're typically going to get nitrogen loss from that. Um, and because of that, essentially the N content shrinks and the P content stays the same. Okay, so our N to P ratio essentially decreases, and it means that there's not as much nitrogen that used to be in that material. So what farmers have historically done is they've applied the manure based on the nitrogen need. Okay, and so when you do that, you often, because there's in that manure, that stored manure, for example, there's less nitrogen for what the crop needs than phosphorus. We essentially end up over applying P. Okay, and so it's very common this situation. And again, going back to phosphorus and the P risk index, and heavily manured fields have historically had a lot of phosphorus buildup. Okay, and so this is one of the challenges of managing, a main challenge of managing manures and managing nutrients from organic sources. Okay, so the recommendation, if you are a conventional grower, the recommendation is to apply manure based on a phosphorus basis, not a nitrogen basis. So we apply to meet sufficient phosphorus, and then we can subsidize by adding additional N if we need to. Okay, that's really, like, from a conventional framework, a much better way to manage those organic nutrients. But there's challenges with this. One, because a lot of times livestock growers have to get rid of, manure essentially becomes a waste if they're applying smaller amounts based on P, and not based on nitrogen, which would almost always be a larger amount of manure, a larger total rate. They've got to put it somewhere. It's got, they've got to get it out of their lagoon or out of their pit. And so where does it go? Okay, so it becomes challenge of essentially needing to get rid of this, waste product. And then the other challenge is that what if you're certified organic and you can't just, go around balancing um, by applying mineral N fertilizer? That's of course against organic certification practices, against our national organic program practice. And so you don't have that luxury, and so you've got to be strategic and think about how we get additional N into that system. Okay, so these are all kind of challenges, and they're in some ways very, I want to call them intractable, but they're very kind of persistent, perennial issues that we deal with when we talk about manure and fertilizer sources. We have calculators and resources available on Ohio State website. There's Ag Crops link here to help growers kind of think through and manage and kind of help close the loop with managing manure. There's also a somewhat dated but still very relevant Ohio Livestock Manure Management Guide. So this is something, a lot of these ideas haven't really changed over the years, but there's resources out there I just want to point you to in terms of managing manure. Okay, so let's shift gears to compost. Thinking about what's the difference between compost and manure. Well, compost is, intentionally aerobically decomposed material. So manures might not be processed in that way. They might be a little bit more raw or, stored kind of by themselves. Compost is a process that's a bit more intentional. It's not just store and then apply, store, apply. The compost is managed to really take nutrients and kind of put them in a very concentrated form. And so, we manage these large piles with a feedstock of, really anything. That could be manure as a feedstock, not a liquid manure, but like a dry manure, solid manure as a feedstock. Dairy cattle is, classic example of something that's dairy manure is something that's often composted. Okay, so it could be food waste, it could be residues, paper, textile products. It could be a lot of different things, right? So you take some typically like green nutrient-rich thing and you mix it with something that's more carbon-rich and less nutrient-dense. You essentially put it in these windrows typically, and then let this aerobic degradation happen, and then typically requires some turning and mixing over the course. So essential requirements for any good composting are air, water, and a balanced mix of carbon and nitrogen materials. So raw things like manure could go into it, and what it does, you mix it with oxygen, respiration happens, decomposition. Water is released, heat's released, gases are released. Again, ammonia gases, a lot of CO2, maybe some methane and nitrous oxide, and then you essentially get a finished compost. This takes months, of course, to do. Carbon-nitrogen ratios are very, very important. This is really kind of the only real trick with managing compost piles and compost operations is getting your green to brown ratios right, or your carbon to nitrogen ratios. So green things would be manure, food scraps, veggie, grass, clippings, leaves, whatever. Browns would be, well, I guess maybe depending on if it's a autumn dropped leaf, it would be a brown material because there's not much nutrient in there. That most of those nutrients have been sequestered back into that tree before that leaf, drops. But things like straw, hay, sawdust, wood chips, shredded newspaper, these are very high. The greens would be low C/N ratios. The browns would be high C/N ratios. We mix these things and we let the magic of microbes happen. Okay. Targeted C/N ratio typically would be something around 25 to 40 for a compost pile. So one of the other key elements of compost is that there's this period of time we need, right? We need compost piles and compost. It takes time to make. It just doesn't. You don't mix it up, let it sit, come back the next day, and voila, right? It takes time. And so, these have been characterized by essentially going through an active phase with high temperatures and then a long curing phase. Okay, so um, getting in good internal temperatures is important for a compost product um, because of a number of things. Killing pathogens, killing weed seeds. These are things that can be regulated depending on if that compost is going to be sold or used, how it's going to be sold or used. And so here we have the S, M, and C, which stands for surface, middle, and center samples. Okay, so basically where that compost pile was sampled. Then we've got temperature, pH, what else we got? Water content, and carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we can see, like, if we look at A, which is our temperature, we in the first, say, 25 days, it really ramps up and then peaks out, and just kind of slowly over the next, say, 5 months or 4 or 5 months, it kind of starts to, steadily decline. Um, Changes in pH, changes in carbon nitrogen ratio as that CO2 is essentially that added carbon from that brown material is respired off. Your C to N ratio essentially decreases. So suffice it to say that the process of making compost is takes time, and it's goes through these various phases. Okay. And then this idea of getting that compost pile up to 130 is this kind of like magic number to kill pathogens and weeds as well, weed seeds. Okay, so NOP, the National Organic Standards. This is a USDA. We haven't talked really much about this, but this is a USDA essentially protocol or standard that if you want to use this as a composting product and call it compost, it's got to be kind of produced via these specifications. And so this is straight from the standards, which says 25 to 40 ratio must be maintained, minimum 131 for 3 days. Okay, so it can get up to 170 or even higher. So the internal component, or the inside of these compost piles, can get very, very, very warm. Okay. All right. So benefits of compost. Compost is kind of like manure, but typically considered to be a higher value and more beneficial product, right? So there's lots of microbial life in compost. There's been lots of work showing that it can enhance disease suppression, or this idea of disease suppressive compost. Of course, there's nutrients in there, and increases fertility, increases CEC of that soil, can improve the texture, the tilth of the soil by improving structure in heavy clay soils or water retention in sandy soils. Increases the buffering capacity and the ability of soils to chelate heavy metals and reduce heavy metal availability. So compost is thought really more as an amendment than a fertilizer. It's not just a fertilizer source. It does a lot more than that. Okay, so we should kind of think of it in a little bit different terms. You know, thinking about comparing fresh manure versus compost, how it's applied, how what it does, etc. Again, at fresh manures, which is represented by it's cow manure with these open circles, is a more raw product, less refined, and because of that, it's going to essentially provide more nitrogen over time than, say, a mature compost. Okay, so here we have an application of manure and compost, and we're getting different rates of nitrogen that is made mineralized and plant available from those two different sources. Okay, so fresh compost manure, fresh non-compost manure will typically have higher nitrogen content than a composted manure. Okay, so this is something it's almost I say will generally have, almost always has, depending, if all things being equal, it will have a higher end content, that raw material. Use of compost manure will contribute more to the total inorganic matter of that soil, because a lot of that carbon in that compost is in a more stabilized form, right? Fresh manure is high in soluble, which can lead soluble end forms, which can lead to salt buildup and even leaching if over applied. Fresh manure may contain high amounts of viable weed seeds, which can of course be introducing weed problems. And this is a major way that weed seeds and noxious weeds are introduced into new regions, right? We've got numerous examples of weed seeds in Ohio that have been brought in through fresh manure. Okay, pathogens, can be part of that equation as well. And so, when we compost manure, we typically, we change it, and it depends on our goals of what we want to use. But composting typically being a more processed product, and there can be benefits with that. Okay. So, just mention a couple other things. So, biosolids, fall into these kind of same organic amendment realm. And when we use the word biosolids, we're typically talking, it's a vague word, but it's typically reserved for materials that have been composted or processed in some way, and often they're human manure or some sort of waste product. So it might be coming from a municipal water treatment plant, or it might be coming from some sort of, like, say, food waste or industrial product or whatever it might be. But when we use the word biosolids, it's often thought of as kind of human manure or maybe some other type of manure. But this, depending on this can be an important source of nutrients that we'd use, right? And that's going to depend on the operation and where it comes from, etc. And then I would just briefly mention with my one slide biochar, another soil amendment that has received a lot of interest. A lot of research has been done on this lately. This is a carbon product that is produced from pyrolysis. Okay, so it's kind of it's the same idea of like making charcoal. It's a slow, relatively low temperature combustion product. And there might be some, more discussion of this, but this is something that, has been used a lot and subject to a lot of research in terms of the ability of this to increase the exchange capacity, the cation exchange capacity of soils, what it does in terms of physical structure. It's a very reactive product, but it has a lot of very interesting properties. So, anyways, some of you, if you're grad students or might be working on this or have run across this, a lot that we could say about biochar. I'll keep it relatively brief here. So, one of the primary things that people are excited about biochar, it's a way that that we can take carbon and we can put it in the soil, and typically it sticks around for many, many years. Nutrient, water holding capacity, etc., etc. Okay, so summarizing, organic amendments are a valuable source of nutrients with many benefits aside from just kind of that mineral nutrition to plants. So we can think about, what it does for organic matter, what it does for the soil structure, for the microbial food webs. When we're dealing with organic amendments are typically more challenging to manage. That's both from a nutrient supply to crops perspective, but also just generally balancing the nutrients, the N to P to, potassium. When we're using organic amendments, essentially the amount of nutrients we're applying are a function of what's the concentration in that product and the rate that we apply that organic amendment. And so, those nutrients might not be perfectly balanced, and we might end up inducing deficiency or an oversupply of one versus the other. Okay. But it's to say that, if I'll just end by saying generically, if we use these more widely and if society valued organic amendments to a larger extent, they could have tremendous environmental benefit, right? And so we're always, from kind of a soil fertility perspective, being big proponents of organic amendments and all the things that you can do. A farmer might look at, say, well, I can either buy fertilizer from, a retailer and know exactly what I'm getting and typically pay less, be a lot less material to haul and apply, than say, buying compost or manure. But the compost and manure might have, typically will bring plenty of other benefits besides just crop nutrition. So it's just important to kind of keep those things in mind when we're thinking about using these as a product. And the benefits, there's pluses and minuses to them, of course, but there's a lot of potential good that they can bring. I will end there.